So when Tether announced that the first real market that they're going to go after is the trade finance market, that made a ton of sense to me because that used to be the business that one might say Switzerland or Singapore, these tax advantaged jurisdictional countries that are permitting that flow. You could actually do it through Bitcoin because Bitcoin is censorship resistant. Bitcoin actually does not have allies nor enemies. And so the idea of having an entity that can dollarize the economy with Bitcoin backing can change the entire backbone of the trade finance market. It's a $1 trillion opportunity, and it's the one that makes the most sense for crypto to go after.
We're here live with Jeff Park. We are seeing like history in the making, not only in the Bitcoin space, but also with Bitcoin Treasury companies.
That's right.
You recently tweeted out that Japan's lost decade birthed SoftBank and dollar hegemony birthed Tether. Now they're aligning. Are we witnessing, the early stages of a full system redesign with Bitcoin at the core? Or how do you explain that?
I think that's why people are so focused today in the United States with two legislative agendas. One is, of course, Bitcoin, the strategic reserve, and market structures around crypto. But the second is stablecoins, right? And this is merging now at a level where it's taken a powerful political force. Rewind 50 years, and at 1971, when Bretton Woods came undone, what you've come to see is that the world that has sustained itself through the fiat economy is no longer sustainable. And I think Japan is really important in this story because it's actually Japan who's been on the other side of being the largest creditor of the US financing markets, where they are also now realizing that they have to develop a way to grow out of it, right? If you've been watching the US 10-year rates, it's around 4.5, 30 years north of that, but it's Japan where we're actually at historic long-term rates that are imploding. And so if Japan can't fund their own economy in reliance of the American export, they're gonna wanna find a different solution. And Bitcoin has now entered the scene, in my opinion, not just because it matters for the Americans, but it really matters for almost all of our trading allies to come together to reimagine what that new monetary order should be. And these Bitcoin treasury companies are representing one of the first innings of integrating Bitcoin into the regulated securities capital markets. And we're going to see a lot of different bullish opportunities come out of that.
And these Bitcoin treasury companies, are they like stacking Bitcoin for something that we're not prepared for, like Bitcoin banks? Or what do you think the end game for it is?
I think every company is approaching it slightly differently. So I think there's going to be variations to how Bitcoin can be useful for certain consumer-facing businesses. In GameStop's example, I think that there's a very high overlap between people who like to play video games and people who might be interested in crypto. And so if you can actually use Bitcoin as a distribution tool to adopt consumer loyalty, that is actually not a financial engineering story the way MicroStrategy is. That's more of a, hey, how do I get the best customer acquisition strategy to onboard my next customers for real operating metrics? So I think we're going to see real businesses that are using Bitcoin for growth that is operating entities. And then of course you'll see the ones that are amassing a lot of Bitcoin to engage in financial services. So Cantor is an example where they are launching a big entity with Tether and SoftBank. And they've made it clear their goal is to offer Bitcoin in programs where there's a lending market, a credit market that will be built on top of that. And for that, you do need scale. And so that's a totally different game. We're talking about what a Bitcoin bank could look like that exists out of an operating company. And I think we're going to see a lot of things that fall in between that spectrum as well.
But most of these companies that are popping up are Bitcoin treasury companies, literally, just
Yeah.
that, like, hey, give me money and we'll put it in Bitcoin, we'll give you Bitcoin per share.
Yeah.
And that is sort of like their service. Is that maintainable?
I think we're about to find out. I think there are reasons to believe that every major jurisdiction with a viable and vibrant capital markets will have their own domestic champion. So for example, I do believe there should be a MicroStrategy equivalent in South Africa, in Korea, in other markets where the option to invest in the Bitcoin spot product may not be viable. And those people still want an alternative to get Bitcoin adjacent exposure in the format that they know, securities that clear in their brokerages. Securities are useful because they have some capital efficiency in the lending market, and that useful product is a viable endeavor. So at that level, I think you'll see a lot of them globally. Now, your question as to do we need 30 of them per jurisdiction, I think the jury's out. I think the good news here is that competition begets better outcome. And for a long time, strategy was the only show in town. And now what you're seeing is there are players like Nakamoto to even Bailey's entity that has emerged, SoftBank with Tether and Cantor. They're going to create different innovative techniques to bring yield to Bitcoin in ways that I think will just push the frontier in a positive direction.
No, but it's good because at the same time, it's a free market. We need the competition. You know, we don't
competition will ultimately lower the cost of capital for end buyers, including you and I, if we were ever to acquire these in the interest of those opportunities. So it's a good thing.
It's a good thing. I like it. You've also called Japan a volatility monetization scheme. What does that mean? And why did SoftBank become the perfect vehicle for it?
Yeah. So Japan has essentially experienced what is called the last decade until more recently, where they were in a negative interest rate environment in the 90s and beyond. And what that means is that they've been actually in a deflationary mode for almost a whole generation. It means if you and I were living in Japan, usually you would expect your salaries to go up by inflation. In Japan, it's the other way around. The norm was your salary would go down. And it's very hard to imagine it. That's what they experienced for a long period of time. And so SoftBank, in a way, was a manifestation of that cancer in the society where to get growth, you had to then go outside the country and invest in high-tech, high-risk, high-reward opportunities. And SoftBank has therefore went on to invest in things like WeWork, Uber, and all these great, and some bad companies, but all of it to drive growth for the entirety of the holdco. The thing that's remarkable is SoftBank actually not only represents the holding co of that Japanese interest in the common shares market, it actually has investors for their vision funds that are sovereigns of other countries. So the Middle East, in fact, the sovereign funds are big investors of SoftBank. So ultimately what this means is that the conduit of the flow, the capital flow, is that sovereign funds are coming into SoftBank. SoftBank is then deploying that fund into things that are either going to be buying Bitcoin, as is the case with CEP, or being able to provide credit in a way that is better than negative interest rate, very low interest rate, that can be accessed offshore, that's not possible in the onshore market. And so the unique opportunity here is Saylor has been very good at capitalizing the demand of the US credit market, but nobody has so far figured out how to access the Japanese bond market. And the Japanese bond market is by far the cheapest bond market in the world. So if you combine the cheapest financing market with the scarcest and most volatile and high-performing equity asset, which is Bitcoin, that is a marriage made in heaven that we have not yet come to see, which I think is the exciting opportunity that we are unearthing here.
It's exciting. And you mentioned Japan being sort of like deflationary. Isn't that ideally what people would see in a hyper-Bitcoinized world?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I think inflation, in a way, has now become proxy towards the growth model itself. Like, if you're growing, it's because there's nominal growth as well as real growth, but generally the challenge being that it's hard to keep up. Like, your wage has not kept up with the actual inflationary growth. And so the idea here, I think, is that Bitcoin serving as a store of value will help lessen that inflationary dynamic, which means you can still grow in a real way. But to outpace that without inflation, I think is the challenge. And it requires a real fiscal discipline by governments around the world to be able to provide for it. And Bitcoin is kind of bringing everyone to the table and saying, hey, if you want to opt out of that, here's another alternative. It's Bitcoin. And that's going to give the expenditure problems a little bit of challenges.
If you're stuck spending dollars, at least stop earning fiat rewards. Use Fold and earn Bitcoin on everyday spending, groceries, travel, even paying bills. And take advantage of Bitcoin rewards with merchants you might already shop with. It's the easiest way to stack sats. So, if you're in the United States and you don't have Fold yet, what are you doing? Buy, earn, and save in Bitcoin, all in one app. Fold is the ultimate toolkit for making Bitcoin savings a daily habit. And now I want to touch on like the U.S. The U.S. has the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, but is that privilege turning into a liability?
That's a great question. The US's greatest export is the dollar. There's no doubt about it. Everyone wants it. And why do they want it? They want it because they think it's a good store of value. They recognize that it's the universal risk-free rate as to benchmark everyone else's returns. And three, the backing of the dollar and its creditworthiness by the United States government is a very strong signal. And those three reasons makes the dollar a very useful financial export. At the same time, we are now hitting record GDP growth debt levels with GDP in ways that are creating some challenges. You might have seen the S&P recently downgraded the US credit for the first time in ways that has shaken the world to say, hey, is this not as good as people thought it was? And I think those are the challenges that the US now has to navigate. And so if you're able to adopt Bitcoin as a part of that collateral pool, I do think there is a way where the synergistic outcome can be a net beneficial thing for the United States too.
Now, going back to Tether, so you've described Tether as a shadow central bank. Is it doing the job legacy finance no longer can?
So there's a great world that people don't know much about because we take it for granted. But a lot of things today, as we know it, is built on the backbone of like trade finance, for example. Almost all commodities that move around the world in logistics, whether it is oil or whether it is iron, those commodities have to be financed. And that financing market actually is a little bit gray because they're usually cross-jurisdictional, right? You're usually involving multiple counterparties that are countries. And then there's maritime law, which of course is a little bit removed from everyone's jurisdiction. And so trade finance is this category that is the closest thing you can get to like sovereignless finance, right? And actually, in a way, Tether represents this exact thing, right? Tether is an offshore entity that is participating in the US dollar economy, but it's not really an American company, and it is not a domestic onshore company. And so when Tether announced that the first real market that they're gonna go after is the trade finance market, that made a ton of sense to me, because that used to be the business that one might say Switzerland or Singapore or Hong Kong, or these tax-advantaged jurisdictional countries, neutral countries that are permitting that flow, no longer needs to be facilitated in that fashion. You could actually do it through Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is censorship resistant. Bitcoin actually does not have allies nor enemies. It is what it is. And so the idea of having an entity that can dollarize the economy with Bitcoin backing can change the entire backbone of the trade finance market. And the trade finance market is by far the largest. It's $1 trillion opportunity. And it's the one that makes the most sense for crypto to go after.
What do you think the deeper story is behind Cantor joining with SoftBank and Tether and Jack Mallers? Is this coordination or coincidence?
Yeah, it's an unlikely mix of characters that are coming together, which I think is why you're asking this question. But I find it to be fascinating because everyone is bringing a special interest advantage to this consortium. So for instance, why is Tether coming in? Tether's coming in because they essentially have a lot of Bitcoin that they can put to use in a way that can actually be a part of the ecosystem to promote real economic growth. And of course, they're participating in the stablecoin market, which hopefully one day will be backed by Bitcoin. And then you have SoftBank on the other side, who, in my opinion, again, it's Japan who actually needs Bitcoin the most as a way to counteract their deflationary world that they're living as a creditor to the United States. And so it makes perfect sense to me that Japan would actually be maybe the most important capital partner you have to onboard. And you need Cantor because you do want US interests represented in this consortium. So Cantor is actually kind of the bridge between this dollarized offshore entity and Japan in ways that I think American bankers can come together and actually build a consortium around it. Where does Jack Mallers fit in? I think we haven't yet had a champion of the Bitcoin narrative that is truly a crypto native technologist at heart. Someone who's approached Bitcoin from the bottom stack up rather than the macro down. And in that sense, we all know as Bitcoiners that at the end of the day, we do need to build some real useful things around Bitcoin beyond just it being a store of value in cold storage, right? Because ultimately, the security model depends on it. And so somebody like Jack, who actually can understand things beyond the layer twos, the lending market, and the ways that he's been an entrepreneur, I think does bring a visionary version of this that is more optimistic about the future of Bitcoin. That is not the same as the nihilistic version of, hey, the world is ending, so you better have Bitcoin as a hedge. The optimism that Jack brings, I think, is also really important for this narrative to move forward in this consortium of very odd actors. So I think that's why he's pulling that role for us.
It's funny you mentioned that about Japan because after being in Japan and seeing everything, many people in Japan actually say that Japan will probably adopt Bitcoin last.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I like that hot take. And what is the hardest part at onboarding institutions to Bitcoin? Is it the regulation, conviction, or understanding?
I think the hardest part is most people are very bad at unlearning things they know. And Bitcoin fundamentally challenges you to unlearn a lot of things that you were told growing up. So I think that's the first human condition that is fairly challenging. The second part is that unless you frame Bitcoin to be an optimistic thing, which I don't think the industry has done a great job to date in making the story of Bitcoin or the story of optimism, then it's really hard to motivate people to get inspired by it with a positive kind of willpower behind it, right? Almost it's easier to get people to do things that makes them feel good. But there's this little notion of like, oh, so if I buy a Bitcoin, am I betting against society? You know, am I betting against like the way that we have actually brought abundance and fruition to the world order? And that psychological chasm is not insignificant. And so the way forward is you actually have to infuse the Bitcoin message with hope and optimism and a lot of positivity. And unless you have a lot more of that energy, and it takes time, I think the other challenge is that people dismiss it for societal reasons that they think this is a net negative, which I think we are on the escape path for at this moment now going forward.
Does Bitcoin become the new monetary anchor or just a quiet hedge for a collapsing system?
Well, I think you nailed the exact question that everyone's trying to answer when they decide to go long Bitcoin. Some people are the types that built bunkers underground and they buy Bitcoin and then they're happy to retire, remove yourself from society. And then you have some people who are buying Bitcoin, but they want that to be a part of the fabric of society that's fully integrated, both politically and socially. And my personal view is that Bitcoin is a technology, but humans are not technologies. We all have to live together. We all have a lot of uncertainties we're navigating with, and that's what makes our life very rich. And so the only path forward is Bitcoin has to be integrated into that world and that path of life. So I have a view that in the future, there will be a lot more abundance that comes from Bitcoin as collateral to different financial services and financial access. And that will actually be a pretty good thing at a universal level where everyone can net benefit and we'll all look at it in a pretty positive way.
And what would you say is your hottest take on Bitcoin?
My hottest take on Bitcoin?
Yeah, make it spicy. Come on, Jeff.
Oh, my hottest take on Bitcoin, man, it is that sooner than later, I do think that it is going to decouple from equities in the way that we know it.
All right. And
sooner than people think.
Awesome. Sooner than you think. And you heard it here first. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Snow.